Imagine you're hosting a dinner party for 15 complete strangers. You have unlimited access to any funds and resources that you may need. Your charge is to create a meal that all 15 of your guests will be able to meet. As you begin imagining your meal, think about what you might include. Are you including exquisite cuts of meat, fresh fruits and vegetables, sweet treats, and the world's finest spices? These factors are important to consider because I have a few questions. Are your guests vegetarians? Are they vegans? Do they follow any specialized diets? I ask these questions because they determine if your meal is accessible. They determine if each of your guests will be able to have a seat at the table. Now, was your meal accessible? The first time I created my meal, I thought I had it made. I had filet mignon, scalloped potatoes, grilled asparagus, and a giant chocolate molten lava cake. But as I began to think about my guests, I realized my meal wasn't accessible at all. I had 3 guests that were vegetarians, 5 guests on specialized diets, and some very picky eaters. I began to realize that I was spending much more time redesigning my meal because I had designed for the norm. What if I had designed my meal for the individual at the onset? 6 months ago, I was a much less tired version of a first-year special educator, and I was sitting in a session about Universal Design for Learning, also known as UDL. UDL is an education framework that asks educators to think about students as individuals at the onset of planning, not make accommodations for them after planning for the norm. But after all, what is the norm? What does average mean? And what is the average student? Most importantly, how does the idea of the average student create the outlier in education? Speaking broadly, there are 2 types of outliers in education: high achievers and low achievers. As a teacher, I hear things all the time that reference this spectrum, such as, you have the lowest group of students in this building, or that is the highest achieving student in mathematics. This spectrum is based on a variety of factors that are intersectional, such as ability level, race, and socioeconomic status. But you see, the idea of the outlier in education is detrimental to all of our students. Students labeled as high achievers face high expectations they feel might not reflect their true abilities. And students labeled as low achievers face slipping expectations and assumptions for poor performance. When we look at the profiles of students labeled as high achievers and low achievers across our nation, what patterns do we see? When we remove the idea of the average student from education, all of our kids have the opportunity to be seen as outliers. Not because they meet the norm or expectation, but because they're seen for their very present and individual talents. Professor L. Todd Rose has a talk called The Myth of Average. He's from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and in this talk, he asks his audience to think about the average student as a myth. Backed by neuroscience, he says educators, corporations, and businesses should see people as individuals. I'm proposing that we take this a step further. What if students were seen as individuals before they even entered the classroom? What if all students were seen as outliers? Not because they range in a particular data set, not because of the zip code where they attend school, and not because they're able to perform in the oppressive and inequitable education system we have. I'd like to introduce you to Chris. Chris is a camper I had when I was a camp counselor at a place for children with disabilities on the moderate to intense spectrum. When I agreed to be a camp counselor that summer, they said, hey, there's going to be a 2-week-long overnight training. And I was intimidated. How was I going to be able to learn to serve each of my campers with special needs? The first morning of camp, butterflies in my stomach, my kids came running off the bus, and I was so nervous. The first day, I connected with Chris. Chris is a fun-loving, tennis ball enthusiast that uses nonverbal communication. When we transitioned from pool to arts and crafts, backpack forward facing, Chris ran and sprinted and yelped to our next activity. And I too ran and sprinted and yelped, afraid for his safety. But what I didn't realize was that Chris was telling me he was excited for our next event. Because I viewed Chris's communication as an outlier compared to average verbal communication in our society, I placed a barrier between us to understand what he was telling me. As the months went on during camp, Chris and I developed a strong relationship. One day, after returning from another incident with a camper, I saw Chris was laying by the poolside, not jumping in, creating huge splashes and cannonballs. Immediately, I went over to Chris, and he told me exactly what he needed through eye gestures and sounds. That summer changed my entire perception on average communication. As I mentioned earlier, I am a first-year special educator. I teach 30 7th and 8th grade students with mild to moderate disabilities. This talk, in large part, is based on our day-to-day learning in our social studies classroom. You see, each of my students is considered an outlier when compared to the spectrum I talked about earlier. They're placed on the low achieving end of the average student. But in my classroom, no one is seen as compared to the average. Everyone's an individual with individual needs. When I plan for units and learning in our classroom, I think about each of my students' brains and what they need to be able to access education. I have to think about this because it creates a seat at the table for them. Now, sometimes that looks like comparing the Electoral College to the NFL, or the rapper Future to entrepreneurship, or sometimes writing stamina to running stamina. But each of this makes it so my kids can access their education. My kids are talented and amazing individuals, and this mode of teaching allows them to achieve rigorous tasks that they are capable of. During our semester 1 exam, my students analyzed 5 historical documents and created a multi-page argumentative essay in a 2-hour time frame. After grading that essay, 75% of my students showed mastery on that exam. What I love about this audience is that we all have unique and diverse education experiences, and in one way or the other, we have been impacted by the outlier spectrum. For me, the outlier paid off when I was the first public servant last year from the College of Education, Criminal Justice, and Human Services to receive the University of Cincinnati's highest undergraduate award. However, the outlier has not paid off when I scored significantly below proficient on almost every high-stakes mathematics standardized test through high school, and I still struggle to calculate tips at restaurants. We're all stakeholders in education, some as students, some as taxpayers, some as administrators, community members, and the best profession of them all, educators. We all have the opportunity to have an impact on education, to make K-12 and higher education a place where everyone is seen as an outlier. Everybody is seen as an individual. It's time to make education a place where everyone has a seat at the table. Thank you.